Judge Amina walked into the courtroom with the same calm confidence that had become a part of her for years. She was a woman of color, standing tall in a field that often made her feel out of place, but she'd earned her spot through hard work and dedication. The sound of her heels clicking on the polished floor echoed in the room as she took her seat at the bench, her eyes briefly scanning the packed courtroom. It was a busy morning. A series of cases were scheduled, ranging from petty theft to serious criminal offenses. But today, the air felt different. There was an extra tension hanging in the room, a feeling of anticipation. The reason for this was Officer Grant, a local police officer who had recently found himself on trial for misconduct. It was a serious case. His actions had come under scrutiny after he was accused of using excessive force during an arrest. His behavior had sparked controversy, and now it was time for him to answer for it in court. Amina had seen her fair share of cases in her career, but there was something about Officer Grant that made her uneasy. She couldn't quite put her finger on it at first, but his attitude from the moment he entered the courtroom had raised a red flag. Grant was tall, with a tough, no-nonsense appearance, the kind of cop who wore his uniform like a badge of pride and authority. But as he took the witness stand, Amina could see the arrogance in his eyes. His eyes scanned the room, lingering longer than necessary on certain individuals. Amina noticed the way he looked at the black defendants and their lawyers, with a dismissive, almost disgusted gaze. It was subtle, but she'd been trained to read people, to notice the little things. The way he spoke to the attorneys, the way he shifted his stance as if to assert dominance. Amina knew that he wasn't just here to defend himself. He was here to show who was in control, and she didn't like it. As the trial began, Officer Grant's behavior became even more apparent. When the prosecutor presented evidence of his misconduct during an arrest, Grant barely reacted. He sat there, arms crossed, as if the whole situation was a mere inconvenience to him. His body language screamed that he didn't believe he had done anything wrong. Amina observed this quietly, trying to keep the proceedings as professional as possible. But then came the moment that would change everything. As the trial continued, Grant began to make more and more dismissive comments under his breath. He sneered at the idea that anyone, especially people of color, could accuse him of anything wrong. He made little jokes about the PEO. The trial moved forward with a new air of tension in the courtroom. Officer Grant, who had once been so confident in his defiance, now sat slouched in his seat, his shoulders hunched as though the weight of his own arrogance had finally caught up with him. Amina's words had struck harder than he had anticipated. The once powerful cop, who had been so sure of his position, now seemed small, his confidence replaced by a quiet, simmering. The verdict was in, and it was clear, Officer Grant was guilty. The room, which had been filled with tension and uncertainty for days, suddenly felt like it had released a collective breath. The weight that had been pressing down on everyone in the courtroom, victims, witnesses, even the audience, seemed to lift, though the consequences of the trial were still far from over. The guilty verdict wasn't the end of the story, it was just the beginning of a new chapter. Amina's heart was racing as she stood at the bench, listening to the judge who was set to deliver the sentence. She had done her job, no one could question that. But she knew the decision today would ripple outward, affecting not just Officer Grant, but everyone involved. The legal system, the people who had come forward to testify, and the city at large all had a stake in what would happen next. She had always believed in the importance of fair justice, but now, more than ever, she understood the weight of her responsibility. The gallery was quiet, as if everyone were waiting for the next part of the story to unfold. The prosecutor, who had worked tirelessly on the case, exchanged looks with Amina. There was no victory to celebrate, not yet, at least. A guilty verdict wasn't a triumph, it was a step toward justice, but it wasn't the final answer. The real challenge lay ahead: how would the system react? How would Officer Grant's punishment be measured against the crimes he had committed? Amina's mind wandered for a moment. She couldn't help but think of the victims who had suffered because of Grant's actions, the people who had been hurt physically, emotionally, and psychologically by a man who had sworn to protect them. How would they feel now that justice had been served? Would it be enough to heal the wounds they had suffered, or would it simply feel like one more step toward the system's accountability? The courtroom remained still as the judge began speaking, delivering the official sentence. Grant's face was unreadable, though his clenched jaw betrayed the frustration he was trying to hide. He had expected many things throughout this trial, defending himself, lying through his teeth, relying on his uniform to shield him from consequence, but never had he anticipated being caught in such a web of truth. He thought he had been untouchable, that his position gave him immunity from the law, but now he was learning the hard way that no one was above it. Amina's role was far from over. As the judge laid down the sentence, she felt the weight of the room's collective eyes on her. People looked to her not just for legal answers, but for moral guidance. She was a symbol of justice, and she knew that the eyes of the world were on her, waiting to see how she would react. Her decision, her ruling, could influence the perception of justice in her community. Would people feel like their voices had been heard, or would they feel like the system had once again failed them? As the sentencing was read aloud, Grant was escorted from the courtroom, his head hanging low, his eyes darting around in search of something, anything to hold onto. The shame he must have felt was evident, but it wasn't enough. The years of unchecked power he had held, the countless times he had wielded his badge as a weapon against those he swore to protect, couldn't be erased in a single moment. It wasn't enough to make up for the lives he had affected. Outside the courtroom, the news of the verdict spread quickly. Social media was abuzz with reactions. For some, it was a victory, proof that the justice system could work when people stood together to make their voices heard. For others, it was a reminder of the work that still needed to be done. The truth was, Officer Grant was just one man, one case in a system that was broken in many ways. The work for change was far from over, and Amina knew that her role was just beginning. The trial had highlighted just how deeply rooted issues of power and privilege were in society. Officer Grant wasn't the problem, he was a symptom of something much larger. The trial was a reminder that police brutality, racial profiling, and discrimination were not just issues of the past, they were present, alive, and far too prevalent. The court had taken a stand, but the battle was far from won. Amina felt that truth in her bones, but she also felt the strength of the people who had spoken up, the voices that had refused to stay silent, the ones who had come forward to testify despite their fears and doubts. The media coverage of the case painted Amina in a new light. People across the city, the country, and even around the world, were talking about her. They were praising her decision to hold Officer Grant accountable, but Amina knew the truth. She hadn't done this for the applause or the recognition. She had done it because it was the right thing to do. She had done it because people had suffered, and it was her job to make sure those who had done wrong were held responsible. The day after the verdict, Amina woke up to a flood of messages and calls. There were those who congratulated her, those who praised her strength, her wisdom, her unwavering commitment to justice. There were others who were skeptical, who asked questions about the bigger picture. They wondered if this trial would actually lead to lasting change or if it would simply be another fleeting moment in history. Amina knew that she couldn't change the system overnight. She knew that this trial was just one small step in a much longer journey. But she also knew that every journey began with a single step. She had made hers, and now it was time for others to follow. As she walked into her office the next morning, her thoughts were still swirling. She had made it through the trial, but now the real work began. There were more cases, more people who needed her help. But Amina felt a sense of purpose like never before. This trial, this case, had shown her what was possible when people stood up for what was right. It had shown her that even when the odds seemed impossible, change could still happen. She sat down at her desk, took a deep breath, and began reviewing her next case. There was still much to be done. The world was watching, and she was ready. Amina wasn't just a judge, she was an agent of change. And she knew that, even though this trial was over, her work had only just begun. Anger. But Amina didn't care about Grant's anger. She was focused on the case, on the facts, on justice. She knew what was at stake here, and it wasn't about her personal victory over a man who had disrespected her. It was about ensuring that the law was upheld and that Officer Grant would answer for his actions. The weight of the decision she had to make loomed over her like a heavy cloud. The truth of the matter was that Grant had to be held accountable, not just for the actions that had led him to this trial, but for every moment he had used his badge as a weapon against those who could not defend themselves. The room was quiet, save for the sounds of papers shuffling and the occasional cough from someone in the gallery. The air felt thick with anticipation as the prosecutor presented new evidence, showing how Officer Grant had repeatedly used excessive force during an arrest. Witness after witness spoke out, describing what they had seen, their testimonies painting a picture of an officer who thought he was untouchable, someone who believed that the badge gave him the right to treat people however he wanted. Grant's defense attorney tried to argue, as attorneys always did, that his client had been acting within the bounds of the law, that he had done nothing wrong. But there was a sense of unease in the courtroom, an undercurrent of disbelief that Grant's actions could possibly be justified. People had seen too much, seen the way he had acted that day, how he had escalated the situation unnecessarily, how he had failed to de-escalate when he should have. Amina listened closely, her eyes sharp as the witnesses spoke. She could feel the weight of their words, their pain, and the injustice they had experienced. These weren't just vague accusations, these were real people who had been affected by the officer's actions. This was about something bigger than one man's wrongdoing. It was about the larger problem of police brutality, about the need for accountability in the system. As the defense attorney spoke, Amina kept her focus. She had seen enough of these cases to know when a defense was weak, and Grant's defense was weak. The attorney kept circling around the facts, trying to point out that there had been some confusion in the way the arrest had unfolded, trying to place blame on the victims instead of the officer. But every time he spoke, Amina felt a little more certain that she was right in her decision to stay firm. There was no way to justify the actions of Officer Grant. The room was getting more and more tense as the trial continued. Grant's demeanor shifted from anger to frustration. He kept glancing over at Amina, clearly seething, but he knew better than to challenge her again. He had tried that once, and it had only made things worse for him. When it was finally time for closing arguments, the prosecutor gave a passionate plea. They spoke about the need for justice, about how this case was about more than just one officer. It was about changing the culture of policing, about making sure that those who were sworn to protect the people were held to the highest standards. They spoke about the courage it took for the witnesses to come forward and share their stories, knowing that doing so wouldn't be easy. They spoke about the victims who had been hurt, not just physically, but emotionally, by the actions of a man who had used his badge as a tool of power and intimidation. Amina couldn't help but feel the weight of the words. She had always believed in justice, but this trial had made her realize just how important it was to stand up for what was right, even when it seemed impossible. It was easy to let injustice slide, to ignore the things that made people uncomfortable. But it was hard to stand up and say, "No, this is wrong," especially when it meant going up against someone in a position of power. Grant's defense attorney followed with his closing remarks, but they felt hollow, like he was speaking just to fill the air. He didn't have the same passion as the prosecutor. There was no genuine defense of Grant's actions, just weak justifications that failed to convince anyone. The attorney spoke about how Grant had been under pressure, how he had been trying to do his job, how there had been a misunderstanding. But Amina wasn't buying it. She had heard it all before, the same tired excuses, the same old defense. She looked at Officer Grant once more. His face was pale now, his confidence completely gone. He had nothing left to hold on to. It was clear that the trial was no longer about his defense, it was about the outcome. Amina knew what she had to do. The jury was dismissed, and the room fell into an anxious silence as they went to deliberate. Amina remained at the bench, her fingers tracing the smooth edge of her gavel. The next few hours would determine Grant's fate, but she knew in her heart that the truth was already clear. There was no doubt in her mind that Officer Grant had used excessive force and that he had been operating with a dangerous mindset, one that saw people as nothing more than obstacles to be dealt with rather than individuals deserving of respect. The tension in the courtroom stretched on. Outside, the world continued, unaware of the battle that was unfolding inside these walls. The people in the room, those who had witnessed the trial, those who had fought for justice, those who had come to understand the significance of the case, knew that this moment would have consequences far beyond the courtroom. This wasn't just about one officer's actions. It was about making sure that justice prevailed and that the truth was heard, no matter how difficult it might be to face. Amina sat still, her expression calm but her mind racing. She had seen this moment before in different cases, but this one felt different. This was more than just a trial. It was a chance to make a real change. She wasn't just judging this case, she was setting an example for all who came after her. She had always believed in the power of the law, in the idea that justice should be blind, but now she saw more clearly than ever that it was her job to make sure that justice was not just done but seen to be done. The jury returned, their faces serious. Amina stood as they filed in, ready to announce their decision. As the foreperson of the jury stood and read the verdict, Amina's heart pounded in her chest. The words would change everything for Officer Grant, for the victims, for the future of policing in their city. Guilty, the foreperson said, and the courtroom erupted in a wave of emotion. Ple involved in the case, laughing at the victim's testimony in a way that made Amina's stomach turn. She could tell that he didn't think he should be held accountable. He thought he was above the law. The tension in the silence in the courtroom felt heavy, almost suffocating. Officer Grant had just been called out for his disrespectful behavior, and the entire room was holding its breath, waiting for the next move. For a moment, it seemed like time stood still. Every eye in the room was fixed on Amina, and even Officer Grant, who had once carried himself with arrogance, now found himself at a crossroads. Grant stood there, rigid and stiff, as if he had been frozen in time. His face was red, and his jaw clenched tightly, trying to maintain control. But Amina could see the frustration in his eyes. He was a man used to having the upper hand, accustomed to using his badge as a shield he thought would protect him from the consequences of his actions. But today, in this courtroom, the rules were different. Amina, still seated behind the bench, met his gaze without flinching. Her eyes were steady, but her mind was racing. She had made it clear that she would not tolerate his behavior, but there was more at stake now. This wasn't just about Officer Grant. It was about the message she was sending to everyone in this courtroom. It was about making sure that people understood that no one, not even those who wore the uniform, was above the law. Officer Grant, she began, her voice carrying a calm but firm authority. You've been given multiple chances to behave appropriately in this court, and each time you've chosen to disrespect the process. I've been patient, but this ends now. Grant's hands trembled slightly, but he still hadn't said a word. It was as if he was trying to figure out his next move, deciding whether to push back or to accept the reality of the situation. Amina could feel the tension in the air. This wasn't just a legal matter anymore, it was a test of power, a moment that would define what was right and what was wrong. The entire room seemed to hold its breath as Officer Grant opened his mouth, his lips moving but no words coming out at first. The longer he hesitated, the more the weight of the situation pressed on him. His usual swagger had disappeared, replaced with uncertainty and a growing sense of fear. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and forced. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, not quite loud enough for the whole room to hear, but loud enough for Amina to catch every word. His comment was a final attempt to diminish her authority, to undermine the situation. It was clear that Grant still didn't respect the power that Amina held. It wasn't enough that he had been warned, he still thought he could challenge her, that he could control the outcome of this trial by sheer force of will. Amina stood up, her gaze unwavering as she faced him. The courtroom was still, waiting for what would come next. "Officer Grant," she said, her voice sharp and deliberate, "I will not allow your words to disrupt these proceedings. If you continue to disrespect this court, I will have no choice but to remove you. This is your last warning." Grant's face twisted with anger, but he remained seated, his fingers twitching at his sides. He looked at Amina as if trying to decide whether or not to push back. But for the first time, Amina could see a flicker of doubt in his eyes. He had pushed and pushed, but now he was starting to realize that there were consequences for his actions. Amina didn't take her eyes off him. She didn't have to. She knew that her words had struck a chord, that the realization was sinking in. She wasn't just a black woman in a position of authority, she was someone who had earned her place, who had worked tirelessly to get here, and who would not back down in the face of adversity. Grant seemed to hesitate for a moment, and then, slowly, he looked away. It was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. He had been forced to acknowledge Amina's authority, and that moment would not be forgotten. It was a shift, a turning point in the trial, and one that would change the course of the case. The silence in the room stretched on for a few more moments, but Amina didn't break it. She simply looked at Grant and then turned her gaze to the prosecutor, signaling for the trial to continue. But as she prepared to move on, Amina couldn't shake the feeling that something important had just happened. It wasn't just about this one officer, this one trial. It was about something larger, something that had been brewing in the background of her career, something that every black person in a position of power had faced at one point or another. The world was full of people like Grant, people who believed that their authority gave them the right to act without consequence, people who thought that their actions, no matter how wrong, would be overlooked. Amina had spent years proving those people wrong. She had fought to be seen as equal, to be respected, and to have her authority acknowledged. And today, in this courtroom, she had done it again. As the trial moved forward, the mood in the room had shifted. There was no longer a feeling of unease hanging in the air. Officer Grant, for all his bluster, had been brought down to size. His posture was no longer as confident. He sat in his seat with his arms crossed, his face flushed with the embarrassment of realizing that he was no longer in control of the situation. But Amina wasn't done. She wasn't about to let him slide just because he had finally fallen in line. She could feel the eyes of the courtroom on her, and she knew that the rest of the world was watching too. This trial was no longer just about Officer Grant's misconduct, it was about the bigger picture. It was about making sure that people understood that no one was above the law. Not even the police. Grant's defense attorney tried to pick up where he left off, but his words were no longer as convincing. It was clear that the tide had turned. The room had been reminded that the court was a place of justice, not intimidation. Amina's firm grip on the situation had set the tone, and it was one that no one in that room would forget. For the rest of the trial, Officer Grant remained quiet. Every time he tried to speak, his voice wavered, lacking the confidence he had entered with. Amina could see it in his eyes. He had been humbled. He had been forced to confront his own behavior, and in doing so, he had lost the one thing he thought he had, control. But Amina wasn't celebrating his downfall. She was focused on the case, on the victims who had suffered because of his actions. She knew that what was happening in this courtroom was bigger than any one individual. It was about making sure that justice was served, no matter who was standing in the way. And as the trial continued, Amina held her ground, her authority unwavering. She wasn't just a judge today. She was a symbol of everything that had been fought for, everything that had been earned. and in that moment, she knew that her actions would echo far beyond this courtroom. Officer Grant may have been forced to acknowledge her authority, but Amina knew that it was the beginning of something much bigger. It was a sign that things were changing, and she was ready to be a part of that change. Ertram was palpable as Officer Grant sat there, visibly fuming. His eyes locked on Judge Amina as she continued to preside over the case with an unshaken calm. But it was clear that Grant wasn't about to back down. His posture had shifted. What had once been a casual, dismissive attitude was now a mixture of arrogance and defiance. He didn't like being challenged, especially by someone he considered beneath him, a black woman in a position of power. Amina could feel the heat of his gaze, but she refused to flinch. She wasn't about to let Officer Grant's behavior distract her from her duty. She had spent her entire career climbing up the judicial ladder, fighting against prejudice and disrespect every step of the way. And now that she had earned the right to sit at the head of the courtroom, she wasn't going to let anyone, especially not a man like him, make her feel small. She glanced down at the case files again, trying to focus on the facts, but Grant's presence in the room was impossible to ignore. His every move seemed to challenge her authority. He shuffled in his seat, muttered under his breath, and rolled his eyes at the slightest mention of the defendant's testimony. The way he acted, it was clear he didn't think he should even be in court, let alone facing any consequences for his actions. As the trial proceeded, Officer Grant began to escalate his behavior. It started with small, subtle comments directed at the defense attorney. Every time the defense made a point, Grant's lips would curl into a smirk, and he'd make little murmurs of disbelief. Amina could hear them, and she knew exactly what they meant. He was mocking the system, mocking everyone in the room, and worst of all, he was mocking her. But she wasn't about to let him get away with it. She maintained her composure, keeping her voice steady as she addressed the prosecutor. "We will continue," she said firmly. "Please present your next piece of evidence." Her words were calm, but there was a sharp edge to them. The entire room seemed to quiet in response, as if they too could feel the shift in the atmosphere. Everyone knew that Amina wasn't someone who would be easily intimidated, but Officer Grant didn't seem to care. He was too wrapped up in his own sense of superiority. Grant's conduct grew more inappropriate with every passing minute. He began to openly roll his eyes, clearly not taking anything seriously. The prosecutor, who had been presenting a detailed breakdown of Grant's actions during the arrest, was doing everything possible to build the case. But Grant just sat there, his face an open display of disdain. It was like he didn't even care about the truth, about justice. Amina could feel her patience thinning, but she refused to let her anger show. Instead, she focused on maintaining control. She knew that if she reacted too harshly, it would only play into Grant's hands. He would twist it into something about her professionalism, trying to paint her as an emotional, unfit judge. But Amina knew better. She had faced far worse than this in her career and had always risen above it. The prosecutor, noticing Grant's lack of respect for the proceedings, shot a glance toward Amina, silently seeking guidance. Amina nodded subtly, her eyes never leaving Grant's. This wasn't just a matter of legal procedure anymore. It was about ensuring that no one, no matter their position or power, could get away with disrespecting the court. As the prosecution continued, Grant leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms and glaring at the witness box. Amina could see him visibly agitated, his jaw clenched in frustration. He wasn't used to being questioned, and certainly not by someone like her. He was used to running the show, to intimidating people into silence with the authority that his badge gave him. But in this courtroom, that authority meant nothing. It was about the law, and the law was blind. No one was above it. Then, without warning, the situation took a turn. The prosecutor had just called for a brief recess, and the room fell into a murmur as people began to stand. Amina reached for her gavel to call for the break when she heard the unmistakable sound of Grant muttering under his breath again. This time, it wasn't directed at the defense attorney, but at her. The words were soft, but not soft enough to escape Amina's trained ears. He was speaking to himself, but Amina knew exactly what he was saying. Does she really think she can control me? A black woman, trying to act like she's the boss here. The words were like a slap in the face, but Amina didn't react. She didn't even flinch. But inside, a quiet fury began to stir. It wasn't just the insult. This wasn't about a personal attack on her. It was about the larger message. It was about how people like Grant believed that they were above the system, above the law, above everyone else. Amina quickly recovered her composure and stood up, her gavel now firmly in hand. The room fell silent as she addressed the court. We will take a short break. Everyone, please remain seated. Her voice was firm, no hint of emotion behind it. But inside, her mind was racing. She could feel her resolve growing stronger with each passing second. Officer Grant, still oblivious to the power dynamics at play, stood up and turned to walk out of the courtroom, but Amina wasn't about to let him go so easily. She couldn't let him think for a second that his actions would be tolerated. Not now, not ever. She stood and walked toward the center of the room, her eyes never leaving Grant. Officer Grant, she said, her voice carrying across the courtroom with an authority that silenced even the murmurs of the audience. You will remain here. This court is not a place for your disrespect. If you cannot behave properly, I will have you removed. Grant stopped mid-step, a look of shock crossing his face. For a brief moment, he seemed confused, as if he couldn't understand why anyone, especially a black woman, would dare speak to him in such a way. He turned slowly to face her, his mouth opening to say something, but Amina was already steps ahead. If you continue to disrespect this court, she continued, her voice calm but unwavering, I will not hesitate to hold you in contempt of court. Grant's face reddened, and his fists clenched at his sides. It was clear that he wasn't used to being spoken to like this. He had expected his usual routine of bullying and intimidating, but Amina wasn't about to let him get away with it. The entire courtroom was still, waiting for the next move. Would Grant back down, or would he escalate things further? Amina knew that the eyes of everyone in the room were on her, and she couldn't afford to show weakness. Not now. Not after everything she had worked for. She didn't take her eyes off Grant as she stepped back toward her bench. The gavel in her hand was a symbol of her authority, a reminder of the years of hard work and sacrifice that had led her here. She wasn't just any judge. She was someone who had earned her position through determination, skill, and an unshakable belief in justice. Grant's anger simmered beneath the surface, but he knew he couldn't challenge Amina without facing consequences. The room seemed to hold its breath as he finally took his seat, his face flushed with embarrassment and frustration. Amina returned to her position behind the bench, her posture straight, her gaze steady. She wasn't going to let Grant's attitude define this case or her career. The fight wasn't just for this trial, it was for every black person who had ever been underestimated, dismissed, or silenced. And Amina was ready to fight. Amina's eyes narrowed slightly as she looked over the case files again, carefully reviewing the details. She had read through everything before, but this time, she couldn't help but feel a sense of injustice stirring inside her. She had grown up facing the kind of racial prejudice that Grant's attitude reflected. She had fought her entire life to get to this position, to prove that she could be just as powerful and just as worthy as any of the men and women who had doubted her. And now, here was this officer, sitting in front of her, showing the same kind of disrespect that had followed her throughout her life. Her hand gently rested on the gavel, a symbol of her authority in the courtroom, but she was careful not to let it fall just yet. Amina had learned how to stay calm under pressure, to keep a steady hand even when everything inside her was screaming to act. But this officer's conduct was starting to test that patience. Grant's arrogance reached its peak when the defense attorney started speaking. The lawyer, attempting to make a case for his client's good character, didn't help the situation. In fact, his attempt to make light of the situation only made things worse. Grant smirked, exchanging glances with his attorney, and Amina caught the subtle eye roll. She knew it was directed at her. She knew he was mocking the whole court. His body language screamed one thing: "You don't belong here." Amina's heart pounded in her chest, but she kept her cool. She had to. She couldn't let him see that his attitude was getting to her. She had to stay strong. The fact that she had worked twice as hard as anyone else in the room to get here made her determined not to let his disrespect go unnoticed. Grant's behavior had become more than just rude, it was an attack. He wasn't just disrespecting the process, he was undermining the very system that had given him the power to protect and serve. She knew she had to put him in his place, but she also knew that doing so would have consequences. This wasn't just a courtroom dispute, this was a matter of public perception. If she acted too harshly, she could be seen as overreacting. But if she allowed him to continue, it would show the world that this kind of behavior was acceptable. And that, she knew, would be a mistake. The case moved forward, and as much as Amina tried to focus on the legal details, Grant's smug expression continued to linger in her mind. He was the embodiment of every racist, every disrespectful person she had ever encountered in her career. It was as if he thought that because he wore the uniform of law enforcement, he had the right to treat everyone around him like they didn't matter. Like they were beneath him. And for the first time in a long while, Amina felt the weight of that powerlessness, the kind of powerlessness that black people, especially black women, had faced for centuries. But she wasn't just any black woman. Amina wasn't about to let a man like Officer Grant define what she could or couldn't do. She wasn't going to let him use his badge as a shield from accountability. She had earned her place in this courtroom, and no one was going to take that away from her. Her thoughts were interrupted by a sharp comment from Grant, aimed directly at the prosecutor. His voice was loud, cutting through the quiet courtroom, and his words were dripping with contempt. It was at that moment that Amina knew she could no longer remain silent. Something had to change. She was no longer just a judge presiding over a case, she was a symbol of justice in a world that didn't always offer it. She cleared her throat and leaned forward, her voice cutting through the tension in the room. "Officer Grant," she began, her tone firm yet calm, "your behavior in this courtroom is unacceptable. You are here to answer for your actions, not to make light of the situation." Grant's face reddened, and he opened his mouth as if to respond, but Amina didn't give him the chance. She raised her hand, signaling him to stop. "We will proceed with the case. And I expect you to respect the process, or I will have no choice but to take action." Her words hung in the air, heavy with authority. The courtroom fell into a deep silence. Everyone could feel it, the shift in the atmosphere. This was no longer just a case of misconduct, this was a test of power, a test of who would be the one to control the room. And Amina was ready to prove that it wasn't going to be Officer Grant.